Welcome to Outsmarting Antisemitism. This is our last and final class. And tonight we are doing lesson 4, which is change of heart. So in your books, we are on page 113, and welcome to this lesson. Up until today, we've spoken about maintaining a trust in God, which helps us to focus our emotions, our psychology. That was lesson 1, in terms of our approach to anti-Semitism. We've spoken about what our approach to our own identity and our Judaism is. In other words, not internalizing the anti-Semitism, remaining proud of who we are as Jews, despite anti-Semitism, or possibly even because of anti-Semitism, etc. And that was lesson 2. We spoke about the importance of Israel and the importance that Israel plays and why it's so important for us to have a homeland in Israel. And how that ties into our Jewish pride. We shouldn't allow any anti-Semitism to be disguised as anti-Israel sentiment. And today, we are finally going to try to figure out, so what do we do with an anti-Semite? Assuming we do have someone that we interact with, and we're not going to start off with a personal person, so a coworker, a colleague, a friend, a non-Jewish friend, etc., who we feel has anti-Semitic bias for whatever reason that comes up. We're going to focus primarily in the beginning in the public arena. Okay, so we all know this concept. This is probably, by the way, the most common form of anti-Semitism that we are faced with. Would say at least on a daily basis, right? Every once in a while we can get a slur thrown at us, but on a daily basis we can open up the news. We all know that we can do this if we'd like to. We can go check what X person in commerce, in media, in politics, in sports says, or even in religion, by the way. Says about Jews. If you just go look right now, Google on any given day, Google what they're saying right now, there's probably something anti-Semitic coming up, because we know who those characters are. And I guess I'd like to start off today's lesson by talking about those people. So I have always found that whenever we do a conversation like this, it's helpful to have a particular person in mind. We are not going to ask anyone to share, mainly because I think this can kind of derail the conversation. We're not here to talk about specific individuals, but you can choose anybody you'd like. I'd like you to try to choose 4 of them, like that. When we're having this conversation, we're going to try to shift what your approach is to these people over the course of the next 90 minutes. Okay, so if you can take a few minutes right now, those that are with us in the classroom, which is only Heidi and Joanne, thank you for being punctual, and those that are watching on the recording, pause the recording if you'd like to. We're going to give 30 seconds. On page 114, take out a pen and come up with a name. All right, if you can't come up with all 4, that's fine. 3 out of 4 is also fine. A famous individual alive, in other words, someone that's probably affecting your life because you're seeing their views, that either they embrace opinions or have acted in ways that are harmful to Jews. Choose somebody in journalism, a reporter, for a newspaper, for a television network, in entertainment, an actor, a director, a producer, whatever it is, right? A TV show, in politics. This can be on the right, this can be on the left, this can be in American politics or elsewhere, if you feel like you have someone else. And I guess I'm talking primarily to people that are on the recording. I know we have some British folks, some Australian folks, some Swiss folks. So if you want to choose somebody from your local country, it's the same thing. To me, it makes no difference. You're not going to be sharing this with me. It's mainly about you having a particular personality in mind, that this is your usual approach to them. And hopefully over the course of today's lesson, we're going to shift that. And then in academia, right? So a scientist, a professor, these days, an epidemiologist, if you have one. They've become very big these days. Anyways, so anybody like that. Now, so the big question on the ground is, once we've established, we've determined, and I'm leaving this to your judgment, but I'm going to assume, especially based on our previous lessons, you have that information, that you're putting some effort into giving people a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, not just calling someone an anti-Semite because you could, or because they said this, but we have somebody that's been established as an anti-Semite for whatever reason, right? The question now becomes, this person is against us. What should we do about it? What should our approach to them be? By the way, I'll share with you, the main reason why I'm not asking you to share your examples is because I don't want this to turn into a political conversation. I'm sure some people choose somebody on the right, some people choose somebody on the left, some people choose somebody from one TV show, some people choose somebody from another TV show, etc. And we all have different opinions. And probably for the most part, we agree about the anti-Semites that there are in the public arena. But okay, so the question becomes, what do we do about it? So that's the reason why I didn't ask you to share your examples. I hope the example we're going to share now is something we can all get on board with, mainly because it's not recent. It's not in our current political arena. It's from 1970. Some of you may remember this. At the time, there was an embargo from the French on the entire Middle East, which started in 1967. We spoke about this, by the way, briefly in the Israel course, for those of you that were with us, Survival of a Nation. And in order to understand France's position in terms of Israel and the Middle East, it's important to go back a little bit. So during the 1950s and 1960s, France was actually the primary supplier, it's hard to imagine today, of Israeli weapons. Okay, now before the outbreak of the Six-Day War, Israel had actually ordered and paid for 50 Mirage fighter jets from France. Okay, now, just before the outbreak of hostilities, President de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle, placed an embargo on the sale of military equipment to the entire region, all sides in the fighting. Okay, now, practically, many people interpreted already this move as anti-Semitic, because in reality, it only impacted Israel. Egypt and Syria and Jordan and Lebanon, they weren't getting arms from France. They were getting their arms from Russia, Soviet Union, etc. Right? So this was just harming Israel. But be that as it may, France had placed an embargo on any sale of any arms to the region. Now, in 1970, which was after the Six-Day War already, but the embargo was still in place, during what was known as the War of Attrition, right? So this is when Egypt came up with a plan that, well, it wasn't known as Egypt then, I think it was known as the United Arab Republic or something like that, right? Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. They weren't calling themselves Egypt for whatever reason, during that period, like the 60s. And I guess through 1970, they were called United Arab Republic. Anyways, so Egypt mounted this small-scale, relentless attack at the forces that were in Sinai at the time, at the Israeli forces that were in Sinai at the time. Okay, so remember, after the Six-Day War, we were all familiar with the fact that Israel's borders grew, and Israel, of course, had forces at their border, which at that point was in Sinai, right, close to the Suez Canal, etc. And Egypt's plan was, let's just wear them out with a slow and steady overtime. This eventually ended in a ceasefire, but before that happened, President Pompidou, who was the president in France at the time, announced that it would be selling Mirage jets to Libya, which of course was a sworn enemy of Israel, even as he continued the arms embargo against Israel. And this, of course, was extremely galling. This was extremely, this was a slap in the face to Israel. As we can see from the New York Times article from January 10th, 1970, and I guess Heidi will ask you to get us started. Text 1, please.
After much hesitation, French officials acknowledged tonight that about 50 Mirage jet fighter planes would be sold to Libya. The confirmation of the sale was expected to provoke sharp protests from Israel. The Israelis suspect that the planes will sooner or later find their way to the fighting fronts. The French Defense Ministry reaffirmed the French embargo policy of selling no arms to the countries directly in conflict: Israel, the United Arab Republic, Jordan, and Syria, and said that they were convinced that Libya sought to supply her own forces. Israeli fears of the Libyan Mirages is based on a conviction shared by some French experts that the Libyan Air Force in its present state could not absorb such numbers of a highly advanced plane. The fear is compounded by the aggressive stance taken toward Israel by the new revolutionary military regime, which has been in power in Libya since early September. The plane sold to Libya is believed to be the Mirage 3, the same type as the 50 built for Israel, but placed under embargo in 1967. The Israelis are expected to find particularly galling the fact that they have been denied about the same number of planes now made available to a hostile Arab country.
Thank you, Heidi. And so here we land at the central question of today's lesson. Anti-Semitism, what should we do about it? We have a man clearly expressing extremely anti-Semitic views, not just views, but actually taking action against Jews. That's immediate. You can almost say that he has blood on his hands, directly giving arms to someone who's going to use them very shortly against Israel. What do we do about it, right? a blatant anti-Semite in clear view. So imagine you're back in 1970, right? And obviously the application is going to be that we can do the same today with the officials that we just listed in exercise 4.1, page 114. What should we do about it? What might be the best strategy, right? So on page 117, we have the question. Same question, just a different era. What might be the best strategy for dealing with a public figure who takes an unfavorable position towards us? List 3 significant do's and don'ts. Mickey, what do you think? You want to try to share with us? If you were living in 1970 and you are just a Jew, as you are today, Jew living in Pasadena, you come to be aware of this, what are 3 big do's and 3 big don'ts, you think, in terms of our approach with President Pompidou?
If you were communicating directly to him?
No.
Not just
No,
talking
just
to
what should be
friends.
the Jewish approach?
Well, I would say you should avoid trying to be a belligerent in response.
Spoken like a true psychiatrist, yeah?
Pardon?
It's spoken like a true mental health professional.
To try
Avoid
to
being
avoid
belligerent.
inflaming the other side, to avoid kind of making a higher level of reactivity. And I mean, that would be the immediate.
That's the big don't.
Yes.
Okay. What are the do's? What should be done?
Well, to be in a dialogue about, is this equitable, or is this?
How would that dialogue take place? Should there be
Pardon?
demonstrations against him? If he
Pardon?
arrives, let's say, in Washington, should there be a demonstration against him? Should there be protesters outside protesting the fact that he's here and he claims to be whatever, the Democrat, etc.? We can't just
Yeah, I would say yes.
but you would put that as part of the dialogue.
To bring public attention to it,
Okay.
I think. I mean, because a lot of the public may not even be aware of it.
Okay. What other do's?
And then it would be to talk with political power, people who are in power, to open up a dialogue with
With him?
Libya about this.
With Libya? You mean with
Well,
France?
I'm in France, right?
Right. Okay. Question. What about taking retaliatory action? Because let's say we had a political, someone who has some sort of ongoing dealing with the French, and they have the ability to take some sort of retaliatory action. Would you think that's appropriate or inappropriate?
Say that again?
Let's say there's an American politician who's
Yeah.
Jewish. If we're going hypothetical, we may as well go all out, right? A Jewish
Yeah.
American politician, and he happens to be best friends with your brother's brother, and you guys are talking about it, right? Not your brother's brother, your brother's cousin, whatever, right? And you guys are talking about it, and there's discussion about what we feel this politician should do. And then it turns out that there's a big contract that he can get involved with, stopping the French from having that contract. In other words, he has an opportunity to do some sort of retaliatory action towards the French and say, oh, you're not going to be providing Israel with whatever, or you're taking these anti-Semitic acts, therefore we're doing X, Y, and Z. Would you encourage or discourage that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would be more in favor of trying to supply Israel with something that could balance what they're not getting.
Of course, there's no question. All of us would be strongly in favor of giving Israel more. The question is, in terms of France, how do we deal with somebody who's anti-Semitic? Okay, I think we see where this conversation is going. We've seen that there can be various different approaches, right? We can get belligerent, we can open up dialogue, right? And none of those things are black and white. Like I think there would be some people who would say a demonstration is belligerent and is possibly bringing to it, I don't know, making him feel uncomfortable, etc. Maybe that's not a good idea. I don't know.
Right.
Okay.
Well, kind of like in the whole realm of, well, should you encourage boycott then?
Same idea.
That works both ways, because then, people say, well, they feel that they're on the right side when they boycott Israel about various things. Not that I agree with that they're on the right side, but is that a legitimate tactic when you feel like that's something you have when to push your side?
Okay. All right. So as with everything that, especially things that are ancient, and any questions we've been dealing with for a long time, the Torah has a lot to say about this. And as it turns out, the direct source in the Torah for this comes from last week's parsha, Yaakov and Esav, right? When we seek a Jewish perspective in any matter, we always look directly to the Torah for guidance, and then we see how Jews have been interpreting the Torah. In other words, how Jews have been applying the Torah to them, and which sections even in the Torah they've been looking to for so many years, right? And as it turns out, last week's parsha is often mentioned by people by Jews who were in this position where they were dealing with anti-Semitic public officials or people in the public arena. Often last week's parsha is quoted, right? So Yaakov and Esav, of course, just to recap, I don't think anybody on here needs a recap. I don't even think anybody on the recording needs a recap, but just in case. Yaakov and Esav, of course, are two brothers who are very, very famous. Yaakov, the Torah tells us, is Ish Tam Yoshev Halim, was a man of peace, a sincere man. He spent most of his days in the tent studying Torah. Esav was a man in the field. He hunted. He wasn't just a hunter. When you start to look through the commentary, you see that he had a lot of blood of human beings on his hands. A thief. He wanted certain items for himself, certain famous items that had been around for since ancient history, and he made sure they ended up by him. Anyways, two polar opposite individuals, right? After the episode with the blessings, Yaakov runs away because Esav wants to kill him. He runs away to a city called Haran, and he spends 20 years, right? 7 years working for Rachel, or who he thinks is Rachel, then turns out to be Leah. Then 7 years for Rachel herself, right? So now he's married to Leah and Rachel. He has all of his children. He works another 7 years for wages, and finally he leaves Lavan and he's headed back to the Holy Land. He's leaving Haran, his uncle Lavan, and he's coming back to the Holy Land. As he's coming back to the Holy Land, he sends messengers to see, to feel out Esav. Last word that he has is that this man wants to murder him. Where does he stand? And he gets a message that Esav is marching towards him with an army of 400 men, all armed to the teeth, all warriors, and clearly this is not a very peaceful approach. So Yaakov famously takes a three-pronged approach, and in text 2, the Medrash explores exactly what he did. Joanne, can I ask you to read for us, please, text 2?
Jacob prepared himself for a three-pronged response: a prayer, a gift, and armed struggle.
So Yaakov is preparing to meet Esav, and he prepares 3 things. He sends gifts. What are the gifts? The gifts in those days, currency in ancient Canaan, in ancient Canaan was what? Sheep, rams, goats, camels, oxen, donkeys. And he sends them, actually, it's pretty brilliant, actually. He sends them in like little entourages, and he sends them, the Torah accounts that they were an eye's gaze away from each other. In other words, he interspersed them in such a manner that from Esav's perspective, he would see one coming over the horizon, and as that one would approach and be right near him, and he would be conversing with that one, another one would appear on the horizon and start coming towards him, and then another one, and then another one. In other words, to give the impression these were unlimited gifts. Anyways, each of these gifts, right, this is Yaakov's version of diplomacy. Each of these gifts comes with a message. Yaakov, your servant, your brother who loves you, he's coming to see you, and that's who these gifts are from, and he wants you to know that he seeks peace. Each time with the emphasis on Yaakov, your servant, etc. Right? Now, we know what Yaakov is doing here. Right? We learned about this in lesson 2. Yaakov is sending gifts, in other words, creating a space for God's protection. He firmly believes prayer is what's going to save him, right? But he's creating a space for God to act in a natural manner. He's doing what he can to call it diplomacy in order that God should be able to send the needed salvation, right? Here's the question. I think it's fair to say that Yaakov was less than thrilled to be taking this approach. In other words, he's about to face an anti-Semite who likes, we all have egos, right? Who likes to show weakness? Who likes to start sending messages? Oh, I'm your servant and I love you and I seek peace, and then it'll make yourself all weak and quiet and this and whatever. Who likes to do that? Not just that, actually when they meet, we're told that Yaakov set up his family in such a manner and the way they bowed and everything so as to appease Esav. Who likes to do that? Who likes to pander to someone that hates them, someone that literally wants to murder them? But in fact, it worked. Joanne, continue, text 3.
Esau ran toward Yaakov and embraced him. He fell on Yaakov's neck and kissed him, and they wept.
So, as we all know, it's like I don't want to call it anticlimactic, right? But all the suspense builds up, and then we're like, breathe a sigh of relief. He hugs him, he kisses him, everything is fine. Now, this is not to say that Esav became the biggest ally of Yaakov, and all of a sudden, Yaakov trusted him as a brother, and that bygones be bygones, and everything's fine, right? In fact, the next psukim, the next verses are where Esav offers Yaakov, either they can travel together or he can station a guard with him, some of his warriors to protect his family. And Yaakov says, no, thank you. We travel slow. You go on ahead. We'll catch up. He's not exactly, he dodged a bullet, but he's not exactly ready to embrace Esav as everything is hunky-dory here. And in fact, if you take a look inside the Torah, here the slide is very important, so I'll pull back up. If you take a look inside the Torah, the word for and Yaakov and Esav kissed him, which is vayishakehu, has a whole bunch of dots on top of it. And the commentary explained that whenever something has dots on this happens a number of times in the Torah. Whenever a word in the Torah is dotted on top, it's to weaken the effect of that word. So text 4, Joanne, once you're at it, why don't you finish off this whole story for us? So text 4 is the Medrash in Sifri, which is one of the most ancient Medrashim, describing what exactly is the meaning of the dots on top of the word Vayishakehu, and he kissed him. Go ahead.
The Torah features dots over the words and kissed him. This is because Esau did not kiss Yaakov wholeheartedly. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai said, it is an established fact that Esau hates Jacob. Nevertheless, his compassion was moved at that time, and he kissed him wholeheartedly.
So it turns out that Esav stayed an anti-Semite. He still hated Yaakov with all of his guts, right? However, in that moment, and we don't know exactly what that means, could be he was feigning love, maybe he had a longer game that he was trying to play, so he was pretending to love Yaakov, or maybe he actually evoked within himself brotherly love. Maybe Yaakov managed to evoke within him brotherly love from all of his actions. The whole scheme was very effective, and he actually managed to remind him of all the different things that he wanted to remind him. I mean, there's so much symbolism there. The commentary are full of it, of all the different things that Yaakov did in the whole move in order to remind him of this and remind him of that and evoke, memories and positive memories and love from Esav to Yaakov, etc. Maybe it all worked. And at that moment, he was full of love for Yaakov. This doesn't mean, however, that the hatred was gone. And this is, in fact, why Yaakov did not want to continue to travel with him and accept him as, his equal and his ally, etc. Anyways. However, the way that the Torah tells us the story seems to imply that even though Yaakov now doesn't have an ally in Esav, that doesn't minimize the effect. I mean, the Torah tells the story with such suspense and builds up and then tells us that Esav kissed Yaakov and hugged him and then they moved on. Clearly, the Torah is trying to send us a message that something here was effective. And this leads us to the question on page 120, which is what lessons does this episode provide the Jewish people in terms of dealing with their foes? Right? Throughout history, the Jewish people have always looked at the stories, particularly in Bereshit, all the stories in the Torah, but particularly in Bereshit, the stories of our forefathers are not just told to us because, this is the history, this is where you come from, and you should know that. No, they're supposed to inform our future. This is nowhere more clear than when the Medrash tells us, Maisa Avot Siman Labanim, that the stories of the patriarchs are all there in the Torah in order to be symbolism or instruction for their children and grandchildren and the offspring that come after them. So the Ramban, Nachmanides, right? Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, famous scholar from the 11th century, gives us some insight as to what exactly might be the instruction that comes out of this parsha. And in fact, he shares with us that historically, this parsha was often looked at by Jews when they were going to confront their foes. Ron, if you can, please, text 5.
The Midrash relates that when Rabbi Yanni would set out for a meeting with the Roman government, he would first read this passage in the Torah regarding Jacob and Esau. The sages had a tradition that this passage was a guide for our exile. Therefore, when Rabbi Yanni would visit the rulers of Rome for communal issues, he would consult this passage to follow the advice of the wise Jacob. It is indeed appropriate for all generations to study his approach and to adopt it in actual practice.
So Rabbi Yanai was a rabbi in Mishnaic times. And whenever he would go, it seems that he often was the messenger to be sent to Rome to petition on behalf of the Jewish people. Whenever he would go there, the Talmud tells, or the Medrash, not Medrash, the Ramban, the Nachmanides is quoting the Medrash, is telling us that before he would go, he would actually open up a Chumash on the way. And he would read the story of Yaakov and Esav in order to provide it with instruction on how this type of encounter works. It was like the JLI of Mishnaic times, you know? That was the Outsmarting Antisemitism course of the time. He would open it up and say, let me just remind myself, let me rebrief. By the way, he did this multiple times. In fact, the Medrash records that Rabbi Yanai would often refuse an escort, a Roman escort home, based on, he would learn lots of different lessons in the story. And he would often refuse a Roman escort home based on the fact that Yaakov refused Esav's escort after Yaakov left. After Esav left, after they parted ways. And then the Medrash goes on to say that one time he forgot to read this passage on his way or on his way back, whatever it was. And therefore he forgot to refuse the Roman escort. He figured, oh, it's a big deal, I'll take it, whatever. And the Roman escort ended up robbing him of everything that he had. I mean, I'm just trying to show you the way that Jews operated for thousands of years, for millennia. Now, there are many lessons that Rabbi Yanai could have derived from the story, but one central idea that seems to be throughout the ages that people would take from this story is that even though, while at the same time it's true that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that where were we here? Here, that even though Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that it is an established fact that Esav hates Jacob, which, by the way, we'll see shortly who he means by that. But still, it is a symbol for all generations afterwards that even if someone hates you, we can and should wield influence over the Esavs of our generation. Now, this is a very, very bold statement. You have an anti-Semite, an open anti-Semite. He's spewing anti-Semitic rhetoric. He's acting in an anti-Semitic manner, trying to undermine the Jews at every step along the way. And here we're being told that we can and should wield influence over him. How does this work? So before we get to how it works, we'll see how common this was. Remember that rabbi who said this? It is an established fact that Esav hates Jacob, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Before I tell you a story about him, let me just clarify that in general, Jacob, of course, refers to the Jews. In fact, another name for Jacob is Israel. And the people of Israel, we are called the people of Israel, or Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, because we come from Yaakov, from Yisrael, from the 12 tribes, which he gave birth to. Esav, who fathered the nation of Edom, again from last week's parasha, Rashi immediately interprets this as being Rome. So another way of looking at this is, it is an established fact that Rome hates Israel. I don't think anybody here needs any convincing, but imagine that you lived during that era. Okay? Now, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, again, the author of this statement, was clearly of the opinion that Rome always hated Israel, or that Rome will always hate the Jews. Not just because of this statement that he said, but because of many episodes that happened throughout his life. Okay? Now, by the way, in fact, probably the most famous story about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, which we celebrate every year, or at least we recount every year on Lag BaOmer, is the story when he found himself in the company of 3 other Talmudic Mishnaic sages, and they were schmoozing. It goes to show the issue with schmoozing too much about politics, even amongst your own, besides sort of being damaging to your own mental health. They were schmoozing about the local Roman governance, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai gave off the impression that the Romans, everything that they did, any good things that they built bathhouses for the Jewish people, and they built gymnasiums, etc. He said all of it they're doing only for their own glory. It's all selfish. They don't want to do good for the Jews. There's still a whole bunch of anti-Semites. They're just doing this in order to whatever, to further their own goals. But even with all this, right, I think we've established Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had clearly made up his mind about Rome. But even with all this, Mickey, take a look at text 6. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
The Roman government once issued a decree that Jews may not observe Shabbat, circumcision, and family purity. The Jews said to themselves, "Who should go to Rome to solicit annulment of the decree? Let Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai go, for he is experienced in miracles."
And indeed, thank you, Mickey. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai travels to Rome. I think the Medrash, the Gemara says, Talmud tells us that what happened was there was a demon that entered the daughter of, like a dibuk, I think, that entered the daughter of the emperor. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai came, and in some sort of Kabbalistic fashion, he removed the dibuk, the demon, from the daughter of the emperor. And as a result, the emperor said, anything that you want, we'll do whatever. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai took the paper of the document of the decree, and he ripped it up, and that was the end of that. Until the next decree, right? Until the next anti-Semitism that came forth from Rome. This is the same Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai who clearly believes that the people that he's petitioning here are a whole bunch of anti-Semites, and they hate his guts, that they're not out to do any good for him. And yet this doesn't stop him from leading an expedition to go to Rome to try to convince them to be nicer to the Jews, to get rid of this decree. So we have Yaakov doing this with Esav, despite the fact that he knows that Esav hates him. And the hatred continues afterwards. Yaakov petitions Esav, sending gifts, diplomatic relations, etc. Right? We then have Rabbi Yanai looking to that story to inform how he's going to petition the local governments. We have Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai doing the same, and it's continued even throughout most of Jewish history. For instance, fast forward to Europe, there were influential court Jews. Anybody ever hear this term? Court Jews? In Hebrew, the word is shtadlanim, which loosely translates into advocates. And their job was to advocate on behalf of the Jewish people of their shtetl, or of their region, in order to try and do whatever they needed to do. And these were successful businessmen, these were, whatever, wise men, these were people who had influence, who happened to be in the right place at the right time. And they would go and they would actually travel in order to try and do whatever they could on behalf of the Jewish people of that area. Without getting too exhaustive, on page 123, we have 6 examples of people. These are shtadlanim from throughout the generations. And again, you see this, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, right? One of the most famous and successful shtadlanim, or advocates on behalf of Jewish people, was Rabbi Yosef of Rashaim, who lived primarily in the 14th century. And he was a court Jew. Shana, you want to read for us a little bit about him? Text 7.
Okay. Joseph of Rashaim, Vienna, 1480 to 1550.
In text 7, we have a quote from him. This is directly from him, from his memoirs of one such story where he went to petition on behalf of the Jewish people. Go ahead. In 1531.
Oh, here we are. Okay. In 1531, the denouncers once again hounded the Emperor Charles V while he was in Belgium and Holland, lands uninhabited by Jews. Many requested that I travel to those lands to oppose the accusers with the help of God. I was at the court of the exalted emperor for 4 months, from the 1st of Adar until the 1st of Sivan, pursuing the interests of the Jewish communities. Although Rothroyd attempted to swallow me alive and to bring about my demise, God in his great mercy sent his messenger and saved me from his hands and from all those who sought to harm me. At that time, I had an audience with the emperor in his private chamber. I spoke to him for as long as I needed, and he responded sympathetically. During this period, when I had free time and was secluded in my room, I authored a book entitled The Sanctified Path.
Thank you, Shana. So this account is not very comprehensive, and there's a couple details that we need to fill in here. not all of which we have all the information for. For instance, he just starts off the denouncers, and we're not entirely sure what it is, what the decree was in that era. But I think it's fair to assume that in 1531, the decree would have revolved around usury, or what level of interest rates Jews were allowed to charge non-Jews. The reason for this was because at that time, Jews were barred from most professions, leaving money lending and banking as one of the only Jewish professions at the time. And as a result, all the non-Jews started to complain that the Jews are ripping them off, and hence was born this anti-Semitic trope that Jews, all they want is money, and they like money, etc., and they try to rob everyone else of their money, etc. So there were many decrees saying, oh, the Jews are not allowed to charge interest, or whatever, effectively saying that they couldn't make any money, since the only profession they were allowed to be involved in was money lending, and they weren't allowed to charge proper interest rates, etc. So they wouldn't be able to make any money. Either, again, it's also unclear who this Rothroyd is. Some people say that it's Martin von Russem, who was a mercenary in the service of several dukes in the area, who was trying to get him, who was trying to delegitimize Rabbi Yosef of Rosheim. Either way, he spent such a long time in the presence of the emperor, right? In other words, he had an audience with him, etc. But it seems that he spent a long time there, and he didn't want to be in the public. He didn't want people to see him. So he was, like we all complained when we were forced into quarantine. He spent a lot of time in quarantine, it seems like, and it was during that time that he authored a sefer, which unfortunately did not survive, which is called Derech HaKodesh, the Sanctified Path. It's quoted, by the way, in a number of other Jewish works from that era that we have today. That book is quoted. This work is quoted. It's a book on morality, etc. Now, one more point to clarify is that this particular official that he's trying to, this emperor that he's trying to placate or sway in the favor of the Jews with whatever way that he has, is actually the grandson of the infamous King Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, those behind the Spanish Inquisition. Okay, now we don't know what Yosef said to this Charles, to this emperor, etc. And we don't know whether he was successful or not. But the idea that he was going there and he was petitioning, even while he says, I was doing so, where's the line, with the help of God. Here, many requested that I travel those lands to oppose the accusers with the help of God. To go there, provide the Jewish voice, while we know that we really rely on God. So again, we see this double-pronged effect, similar to Yaakov, where he's praying to God, and yet he is doing certain diplomatic moves to try and sway even the deepest of anti-Semites. To be sure, this model didn't always work. We don't even know if Rabbi Yosef Roshem's worked, but we know of other situations where it did not work. One of the most famous examples, let me pull it up here on the screen. This is a famous painting, at least that's supposed to be. Right, so we have Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who travels to Rome. We have another instance here, which is the Abarbanel. This is a fairly famous painting. The religious symbols in it have been removed. This is a holy lesson in Torah study, so certain religious symbols have been removed to preserve that sanctity. But it's supposed to depict the Abarbanel, who you see. I don't know if you can see my cursor. That's the Abarbanel, a very famous Jewish sage who was very, very wealthy. And he went, right, Rabbi Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, and he went to King Ferdinand and Isabella and tried to reverse the decree of the expulsion of the Jewish people. Now, we all know that didn't work. Why it didn't work is unclear. Some people say because Thomas de Torquemada, who was the Grand Inquisitor of the time, who also apparently is depicted here, that's supposed to be him, I guess, walked in and he said, Judas sold him for 30 pieces of silver, now you want to sell him again? And apparently that swayed them in the other direction. Either way, in this situation, it didn't work. And the Jews, of course, were expelled from Spain in one of the most, sadistic forms of anti-Semitism to date, right? The expulsion of the Jews from Spain, as we know, which ended an amazing era for the Jews. This seems to be a consistent theme, but let's take a moment to analyze this theme, okay? What about the fact that when you do this, you look like you're begging and you're kind of lowering your pride and lowering yourself to these anti-Semites? What about that? Right? What about the fact that pleading with an authority makes one feel inferior? Okay. So I think to this, I would say that, and you may have noticed that I was between the lines emphasizing this as we went along, that if you take a look at all of those stories, they never come with a position of inferiority. In fact, if I had any say in the matter, I would make that a prerequisite. If you're going to be a shtadlan, or whatever you're calling it at any particular era in history, in other words, you're going to be pleading or advocating on behalf of the Jewish people, you have to have a healthy sense of your identity. Even, and let's go back all the way to Yaakov. Even while you are trying to do certain diplomatic moves, it has to be clear in your mind that this man in front of you plays no role in your fate. You have to do what you need to do in order for God to allow God a space to act, but you come aware that it's really your prayer, using the example of Yaakov, or your ability to enact miracles, in the case of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, again, a godly intervention, or the prayer to God, in the case of Rabbi Yosef of Rashaim, or in the case of Rabbi Barbanel, etc. It has to be clear. I would make this a prerequisite for anybody. If you're planning to be an advocate on behalf of Jewish people, we can apply this even until today, right? If you're going to take a position in politics, you're going to try to sway certain people's political opinion in order to get it to be more favorable to the Jews, the first thing I want you to have is a clear sense of self-identity that you recognize that you live higher, that you're connected higher with God. And that immediately takes away that feeling of inferiority. Okay? But leaving that part aside, let's say we can get on board with doing it. Does it have any chance of working? What are we hoping to accomplish? You're coming to an anti-Semite, a man, a woman, an official, an actor, a director, anybody who clearly says, I hate Jews. We're not talking here about closet anti-Semites. We're talking about people, back to the story of Pompidou, right, from France. We're talking about somebody, he clearly wasn't embarrassed of the fact that he was an anti-Semite. He had anti-Semitic views, and as we said, this can come from a void within them. This can come from lots of places. How do you attempt to cure them of that and say, oh, but still, maybe you could also give, like Mickey suggested earlier, maybe you could also give fighter jets to Israel? The man clearly took a position. Like, what do you hope to accomplish here? So in order to do this, and I guess this is what I'd like to do with the remainder of my time, we need to dig into the science of hate. And by that I mean not the psychology of hate. We discussed that already. That often comes from a ditch complex, a void within them, or just Achashverosh type of anti-Semitism, or Antiochus type of, all the different types that we had. Well, let's talk about the science of hate. Assuming that one of those things is at play inside an anti-Semite's psyche, now what about the science behind it? Does that mean that they become 100% a hater? Pop culture says, yeah, right? Haters gonna hate. That's the line they throw out, right? Haters gonna hate, and you're not gonna change that. But actually, science says otherwise. Particularly modern neuroscience. This is a story we all will remember, but I'll recount it just to get us back in the zone here. On July 28th, 2006, actor Mel Gibson was pulled over for speeding in Malibu, California. Gibson failed the breathalyzer test, but he refused arrest and he had to be handcuffed. All the while he's cussing and everything, the whole thing. He's forced into the squad car. While he's in the squad car, he asks his officer, who was a fellow by the name of James Mee, if he was Jewish. When he learned that he was, he started to direct every anti-Semitic slur and curse in the book at this poor police officer who was just doing his job. This was the context in which the line, which you've probably heard attributed to Gibson, was hollered. Jews are responsible for all the wars in the world. Right? The fella, he's drunk, clearly has a lot of anti-Semitic tendencies, and he lets this out. The news media had a field day, right? This is even before cancel culture came on the scene, right? But the news media had a field day. Gibson later offered an apology. He said he hopes that people will realize that he's not a bigot, he's not an anti-Semite, he just said these words in a fit of anger. So some commentators on this story take the approach that, who are you fooling? We get it. You're an actor and you have to save face. You're going to say you apologize. You're not really an anti-Semite. You just said it because you were angry. But we know that this showed your true colors. And the question is, does it work that way? On a neuroscientific level, right? In other words, if we actually crawl into people's brain spaces, is that actually how people form opinions, right? For example, Gibson's friend, a Jewish friend, Dean Devlin, they always seem to come up at, they come up in convenient situations. And he got up and he stated publicly that he spends a lot of time with Gibson. He's not an anti-Semite. And to him, Gibson's remark were more of a result of his alcohol abuse and his anger and his fit. It said nothing about the man himself and his views of Jews, right? Here's the question. Is that the case? Can we split the hatred, right? Can we split the hatred from the hater? Can we split as the quote goes, there's as much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and others. I think that comes from a famous poet. Anyways, but the question is, can we say that inside a human being, inside their brains, there's actually, you can tune in to different parts of their brains that sometimes they hate and sometimes they don't. So let's try to dive into it. Where are we here? Lisa, are you with us? Can you read for us? I guess not. Oh, here she is. Okay, can you read text 8A for us? Cognitive diversity. So this is from David Eagleman, who is a neuroscientist and author, of course. And he has a book called Incognito, The Secret Lives of the Brain, in which he's trying to dissect what goes on inside a person's brain. Go ahead.
Brains are like representative democracies. They are built of multiple overlapping experts who weigh in and compete over different choices. There is an ongoing conversation among the different factions in your brain, each competing to control the single output channel of your behavior. When the hostess at a party offers chocolate cake, you find yourself on the horns of a dilemma. Some parts of your brain have evolved to crave the rich energy source of the sugar, and other parts care about the negative consequences, such as the health of your heart. Part of you wants the cake, and part of you tries to muster the fortitude to forego it. The final vote of the parliament determines which party controls your actions. That is, whether you put your hand up or out. As the French essayist Michel de Montaigne put it, there is as much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and others.
So it's not a poet. There we go. That's a philosopher. Anyways, thank you, Lisa. So he's claiming that actually just because somebody says something, that doesn't mean that that's everything that they believe. Now, there's clearly a lot of anti-Semitism in somebody that's spewing an anti-Semitic remark. Someone who only has love in his heart for the Jews doesn't even have that kind of language in his brain, right? We're not taking with the fact the person is an anti-Semite. What we're trying to discuss here is there value to labeling the person an anti-Semite and cutting him off and saying, you are an anti-Semite, we want nothing to do with you, we just want you canceled? Or is there possibly another route in? Not a big route, by the way. We're not talking here, oh, you can dig deep and deal within him that he loves the Jews. No. But maybe depending on the situation in which he's in, he or she reacts a different way. And then David Eagleman goes on to address this actual scenario of Mel Gibson. Heidi, can you read for us text 8B, please? Team of rivals.
Oh, sorry. Returning to Mel Gibson and his drunken tirade, we can ask whether there is such a thing as true colors. We have seen that behavior is the outcome of the battle among internal systems. To be clear, I'm not defending Gibson's despicable behavior, but I am saying that a team of rivals' brain can naturally harbor both racist and non-racist feelings. Alcohol is not a truth serum. Instead, it tends to tip the battle toward the short-term, unreflective faction, which has no more or less claim than any other faction to be the true one.
There's a lot to unpack here, so let's take this one at a time. Okay, first of all, that line, alcohol is not a truth serum. There's been a lot of research on this recently. A lot of it was quoted recently in Malcolm Gladwell's most recent book. Raise your hand, anybody read Talking to Strangers?
Mm-mm.
Just recently, he's a very popular writer. He's not so much of a researcher, but he culls from different research from people like David Eagleman, and puts it together. And he has a number of chapters about what alcohol does to our brains and what it doesn't do to our brains. Unfortunately, there is a very, very big myth among human beings, and it only works one way. When we view others under the influence of alcohol, we are convinced that anything that they are doing or saying now is truth. The alcohol got to them. See, that's their true colors. Now, if we were to turn this on anyone else, in other words, if we were to turn this on if anyone were to turn this on ourselves, none of us would agree with that. No, I don't believe there's a single person on this Zoom right now that would say anything that I've ever said under alcohol, oh, actually, that's what I really believe on my deepest level. Perhaps sometimes, perhaps it opens up certain avenues to be able to be more honest, etc. But certainly to be able to make a rule that everything we've said while we've been under the influence of alcohol, I mean, certainly myself, I would not want anybody to judge myself that way. And as a result, we have no right to judge other people that way. We like, as human beings, to put people into neat categories. That's the way we are. We search for patterns, even visually. For instance, we're all familiar with the fact that there are these visual optical illusions. I'm sure we've all seen them, right? Where they put a whole bunch of things in a row, and whichever optical illusion it is, honestly, take your pick. Usually, the problem is that we're just making an assumption that the rest of it works that way. Like there was one recently floating around Facebook where there's a whole bunch of 8s, and you have to find the 3 because the 3 is missing the 2 other half circles, right? Our brain automatically fills them in because it's trying to make a pattern out of it. Similarly, we do this with human beings. We like to fit people into neat categories. This fella, anti-Semite. This fella, supporter of the Jews. In fact, both of them are most likely not true. Not to say that we should avoid saying this person is an anti-Semite because they said a lot of anti-Semitic things. We just should not allow. Hate is certainly there. We just shouldn't assume that it's omnipresent and that every single time this person interacts with Jews, he's being a hater of Jews. This goes all the way back to Yaakov. This was Yaakov's approach with Esav. I don't think anybody believes that Yaakov sincerely thought that now Esav loved Jews. Now Esav loved Yaakov, and that's it. No. In fact, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai goes on to say, Halacha Esav sonat Yaakov. It's an established fact that Esav, Rome, whichever you want to look at it, hates Yaakov and the Jews. However, that doesn't mean there isn't a pathway through where we can appeal to, in David Eagleman's words, to a particular judge in the brain or a particular team player in the brain, and say maybe I can find a pathway through to a friendly approach. And that is the theory behind the Shtadlan. That is the theory behind any advocate that there ever has been for Jews, and that should be our approach going forward with regards to any modern dilemma like that. So let's see how that gets applied. Back to President Pompidou, right? Obviously, we live today in a very different era. The choice isn't between gifts and war. Usually, the only course of action was gifts. I don't know that Yosef of Roshaim was coming to him and saying, listen, here are these gifts about the Jewish people, and if you don't, then we're going to wage war against you, right? That was Yaakov's approach. Usually it's more diplomacy. But perhaps there are certain threatening things that he could have done. Maybe he could have arranged a demonstration outside the palace. And honestly, whenever war was an option, usually rabbis worked on diffusing that attitude among Jews. For instance, Rabbi Yoshua is famously recounted as diffusing sentiment among the Jewish people when the Romans raised the taxes yet again, or whatever it was, and the Jews were going to form a rebellion. Rabbi Yoshua diffused it, and that was viewed as a positive move. Okay, but today we live in a very different world. Most Jews live in democracies where there's freedom of speech. As a result, Jews can engage in wars of words, right? We can post on our social media. We can join a political fight against them, or we can sign a petition, whether it's a celebrity, a journalist. We can boycott, as Mickey mentioned earlier, et cetera, right? We can do all sorts of things. And indeed, when the French president, Pompidou, came to the United States in 1970, he was met with fierce demonstrations. Joanna, are you still with us? Okay, we'll move on to Mickey. Text 9, again, the New York Times.
Text 9. Okay. An angry president. President Nixon made a hurried trip to New York yesterday to apologize to President Pompidou, who was angered by what he termed insults to himself and his wife during pro-Israeli demonstrations, touched off by his state visit to the United States. The French president had been angered by a jostling that members of his party received from demonstrators in Chicago, whose actions were marked by boos and angry cries and by what he viewed as acceptance of such hostile acts by the Chicago police.
So, thank you, Mickey. So in ancient times, Yaakov had the ability to fight a war. But then for a long period of history, there wasn't really any way to threaten the person in power. But in today's day and age, we have the option to wage war against our opponents, right? In the Torah, Yaakov had that option and he didn't prepare for it, but he decided to first try diplomatic routes by sending gifts, by calling himself his servant, etc. And the question is, should we do so? The Rebbe took a very firm approach with that the answer was no. We should not threaten, but we should not make them feel threatened by us, but rather instead we should take a diplomatic approach. In Mickey's words, we should not become belligerent, rather we should try to open dialogue. Joanne, can you read text 10a for us, please?
Okay. The public protests against the president of France angered French officials. This blocked any lobbying efforts that French Jews might have been able to make to prevent or at least reduce French assistance to Arab countries that are hostile to Israel. The stated reason for these protests was to demonstrate that America is a democratic country and that American Jews are not cowardly. This is a worthwhile objective when Jews' lives are not at risk. However, when Jews are threatened with the sale of many military jets to Libya, we have two options. We can organize public protests, or we can make every effort to either prevent or postpone the sale, reduce the number of jets sold, or to at least prevail upon the French to send less effective planes. Such aims can only be achieved through quiet diplomacy. The proof is that agreements of this nature have been reached in the past.
The Rebbe encouraged Jews at that time not to disregard the possibility of influence. Even when somebody is a clear and stated anti-Semite, there is possibility that we can influence them. And we'll get to some of these examples here in just a moment. The Rebbe doesn't say what he felt could have been achieved, but a year later, and at least not in this talk, but a year later, and past agreements that that might have been ruined through demonstrations. The Rebbe was talking very cryptically, but a year later, the Rebbe did clarify. Ron, can you read for us text 10b?
When Mr. Pompidou visited the United States, there were mass protests against him intended to intimidate France. This effort backfired. It can now be said that despite the French embargo against selling arms to belligerents in the Middle East, the French president had allowed the sale of small arms and light weapons to Israel. It's items that can be sold without attracting publicity. However, as a result of the demonstrations, the approval for such sales was withdrawn. After some time, when he was no longer being disparaged, he resumed dealing with Jews behind closed doors and reinstituted the small arms sales. He also arranged for 300 Jews to be able to leave Egypt. All of this was accomplished without demonstrations and without publicity. The Jewish media was warned against disclosing any of this, and we only know of this from the non-Jewish press. The conclusion we must draw from this case is that we do not influence anti-Semites by consistently yelling at them, "You are an anti-Semite. You are a thief. You are a murderer." Rather, engage them in diplomatic conversation. Although such individuals are well aware of what we think about them, they are nevertheless human beings and wish to behave like human beings.
Thank you, Ron. In the words of David Eagleman, I would say, they're still human beings, and there's a pathway there, somewhere there, where you can appeal to a certain part of them, that you can get them to just for a moment hug and kiss you, like Esav did. Even if you won't be able to change their mind entirely and turn them into the biggest lover of Jews. Now, that's one example of the age-old approach of diplomacy working. A more extreme example can be found in Jesse Helms. Jesse Helms was elected to the United States Senate in 1972, a senator from North Carolina. And for more than a decade, he voted consistently against the interests of Israel. For example, he voted against all foreign aid to Israel. In 1982, after Israel invaded Lebanon, he suggested that the United States break relations with Israel entirely, right? I think we all know what we would say about him if he was around today, right? We'd put him on the squad, right? We'd say many pro-Israel groups at the time did say it. They were very angered by Helms. They tried to unseat him and to get him, impeached and things like that, etc. In 1984, smack in the middle of his, his whole story going on. This is 2 years after Helms suggested that the United States break relations with Israel. Chabad held an event in Washington, D.C. by Levi Shem Tov. Raise your hands. Anybody familiar with him or heard of him? He's the Chabad representative to Washington, D.C. today. But his father, Rabbi Abraham Shem Tov, who's in his 80s, and may he live and be well, campaigned for all sorts of Chabad things in Washington, etc. Was friendly with the Jewish senators and the politicians, etc. So in 1984, Chabad is holding an event in Washington, D.C. The reason is to celebrate the fact that Ronald Reagan, President Reagan had and both houses of Congress had designated the Lubavitcher Rebbe's 82nd birthday as Education Day USA. Okay? The purpose of the gathering was to promote an agenda that the Rebbe had, that there should be an upgrade in ethical and moral foundations of education in American public schools. Some of you might be familiar with the Rebbe's campaign for a moment of silence, etc. In other words, without teaching actively about God in public schools, introducing morality and a sense of higher power into the public school system, without violating the separation of church and state. The Rebbe was very, very pro this. Among the high-profile attendees of this event was Senator Jesse Helms. And you can imagine the gishrei when Alan Dershowitz, right, the Harvard professor, when he heard about this, he wrote to the Rebbe. Yeah, he had a little bit of a relationship with the Rebbe, right? The Rebbe is objecting the fact that Lubavitch is honoring Jesse Helms. Lubavitch wasn't honoring him. He was just invited and he was there. He was a Jewish senator, not Jewish. He was a senator that Chabad had some sort of ties with, whatever. So he was invited. And he was there. And his objection was, look, he consistently votes anti-Israel. He's no friend of the Jews. We should not be honored. We should not be giving him. We should not be dignifying him in any way. And the Rebbe, he wrote back, and the gist of the letter primarily was that Chabad was not honoring Jesse Helms. The fact that he attended the dinner doesn't mean anything. But then the Rebbe added a postscript, and we're going to read only the postscript because that's probably most informative to our lesson today, and it's text 11. Shayna, can you please?
Subject to change. I trust you will agree that in regard to persons of influence, whether in Washington or elsewhere, the first objective should be to persuade and encourage such a person to use his influence in a positive way in behalf of any and all good causes which are important to us. We should welcome every public appearance which lends public support to the cause, especially when there is a likelihood that it may be the forerunner of similar pronouncements in the future. My experience with such people, though I have never personally met the said person, has convinced me that politicians are generally motivated more by expediency than by conviction. In other words, their public pronouncements on various issues do not stem from categorical principles or religious imperatives. Hence, most of them, if not all, are subject to change in their positions, depending on time, place, and other factors. I believe, therefore, that the proper approach to such persons by Jewish leaders should not be rigid. As a rule, it does no good to engage in a cold war, which may often turn into a hot war, nor does it serve any useful purpose to brand one as an enemy or an anti-Semite. However tempting it is to do so, even if that person vehemently denies it, it can only be counterproductive. On the contrary, ways and means should be found to persuade such a person to take a favorable stance, at least publicly. We haven't too many friends, and attaching labels, etc., will not gain us any. Instances abound where the approach advocated above produced good results. There is surely no need to point out to you that responsible Jewish leaders consistently cultivated good public relations, indeed, even cordial relations with President Carter and his predecessors, going back to President Roosevelt, regardless of their sometimes openly negative feelings towards Jews and Jewish causes.
Thank you, Shana. A couple things here. First of all, the Rebbe writes, instances abound where the approach advocated above produced good results. The Rebbe is referring here to an effort by the Israeli government, a successful effort, might I add, by the Israeli government to gain the political support of Jerry Falwell, who was the leader of the moral majority. Despite the fact that he made a lot of unfavorable statements about Israel, in 1979, the Israeli government gifted him a Lear jet. In 1981, he was honored with the prestigious Jabotinsky Award, and the effort was successful, and Falwell became a staunch supporter of Israel. Now, so this is what the Rebbe says in a postscript to Alan Dershowitz. That's the end of the story, so far as we have it from the Rebbe's perspective. But when Alan Dershowitz says the story today, he finishes off, and I'll quote. He says, sure enough, very shortly after, Senator Helms assumed a very influential role in the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he became one of the strongest supporters of Israel and of other Jewish causes as well. So obviously the Rebbe had an enormous influence on persuading Jesse Helms that even with his very conservative values, he could become a beacon for the Jewish people and the Jewish state. Those are Alan Dershowitz's words. Now, we can't know precisely why Jesse Helms changed his stance on Israel. Professor Dershowitz might have been right. Could be the Chabad's invented it. Could be it was, a general approach. Could be Alan Dershowitz himself said or did, whatever, right? The important lesson here, I think, is that we should recognize that just because somebody has done something anti-Semitic doesn't mean we now label them as an anti-Semite and they're off the table. I mean, we can't convince ourselves that we're going to turn them into a lover of the Jews, even if it was with Jesse Helms. By the way, it goes the other way as well. In other words, let's try to analyze here. Where does this whole story leave us, right? I think it's important for us to remember that we shouldn't try to stick people in these boxes. And I'm going to swing now to the other way as well. Where there is Jewish benefit, it's a victory for Jews. If somebody supports Israel, if somebody is consistently supporting Israel, if somebody is doing something good for Jewish people in their area, in their county, in their city, in their state, that's a victory for Jews. I don't know that Jews ever should be labeling someone as, this is our friend, and therefore we should do things for him. That's making the same mistake on the other side. The same inferiority complex that we're displaying when we're trying to pander to a non-Jew's influence, and it was anti-Semitic, we're trying to get them to show some favor towards the Jews, right? And we have this inferiority complex, and that's why we don't want to do it, because we don't want to beg. And the real true remedy to that inferiority complex is recognizing that Hashem is the one pulling the strings here, right? That same inferiority complex works the other way around. When we convince ourselves that this particular senator or this particular politician, that's where our salvation comes from, because they're currently voting pro-Israel or acting pro-Israel or acting pro-Jews, even outside of Israel, etc. What we're doing is we're showing that same inferiority complex. We don't have an identity of who we are and the fact that we trust in God and we know that this is true. No, we think it comes from in Psalm 1, I think it's 147, 146. It says, Al tiftuchu b'nedivim b'bnei Adam, she'ein lo Yeshua. And we should never put our trust in human beings. Does that mean that we don't show trust to human beings, that we don't appreciate when somebody does something good? Of course not. Of course we do. And of course we should condemn when somebody says something wrong. But labeling them an anti-Semite and saying we will not invite him to a dinner, honoring him might have been a very different story, right? But that gains us nothing. We should be slower to name and shame and quicker to engage and influence, or in the words of a wise man on this Zoom, to open dialogue to see what can be accomplished. Now, here's the brilliance of this, because this is where this leaves us all. I promised at the beginning of this course, and to some of you, even in the marketing for this course, that we would not spend too much time focusing on things that only relate to public officials. And yet, for the past while, I think most of you don't know any of the anti-Semites that you've put on your list of the 4 people, and you don't have any way of influencing them. So everything that we said today is, of course, relevant to community leaders. That's a very, very important point. However, it also becomes relevant on an individual level to every single one of us. Many of us have that guy at work, that classmate, on the college campus, or that neighbor who we know is an anti-Semite, and they've been branded as such in our heads. Maybe it's even because of a comment they said. Maybe you even have hardcore proof. There's someone in Pasadena who I know, Jewish fella, actually very involved in Jewish life. He's not an Orthodox rabbi, but he's a rabbi, and he's a teacher, a Jewish educator, etc. And next door to him, he tells me, he knows that the fellow who lives next door to him is the author of some blog that's anti-Semitic in nature, and that he calls him a neo-Nazi, etc., right? On an individual level, and I'm not even talking about somebody that's so high up there like that. What's if it's just somebody next door? You believe the anti-Semitic tendencies. So therefore, your approach is, I'm labeling them an anti-Semite. I want nothing to do with them. Maybe I'm going to avoid them, whatever. And I'm going to try to undermine any sort of anti-Semitic thing that they say. I think we would do well to remember that engaging in a cold war, such as that, often leads to a hot war, whatever that hot war may end up being in your personal life. And there's one more very important lesson that I want to emphasize. Given the complexity of this whole discussion about the complexity of the human brain, this point we spoke about already, which is we don't put our trust in friends, we put our trust in God, and we recognize it. It's that same inferiority complex at work. But given this whole conversation, about the complexity of the human brain and how this whole thing works, I think it's important for us to remember that education goes a very, very long way. Hatred in a person's heart, in a person's brain, doesn't start when they are adults. It starts when they are children. And if we're trying, as this course posits to be doing, to outsmart anti-Semitism at its core and at its root, then we would do well to try to influence the educational system in the United States. And this is where the Rebbe's agenda of trying to introduce some education and morality into the public school system comes in. Education should not be, the Rebbe would often say, about accruing knowledge, but accumulating knowledge, math and science and all that sort of thing. Education should be about bringing up children that know how to act like a mensch, even if they don't speak Yiddish, right? Even if they're not Jewish. And I think in that regard, unfortunately, the public school system is to a large degree failing the next generation. I don't know how much effort is being placed on our college campuses, in our high schools. There's a lot of emphasis being placed on what we like to call education, which is accumulation of knowledge. But in terms of bringing them up to be a mensch, to care, to have compassion, to love other people, and to actually feel for other people, I don't know that we're doing that. And I think that we, even here in Pasadena, can do a lot to generate goodness in our environments. Please turn your attention to the video screen. Oops.
Negative thoughts, actions, and speech create negative energy. Conversely, positive thoughts, actions, and speech create positive energy. And that's what led, with an idea that has its genesis in South Africa, to the idea of ARC, acts of random kindness. You see, this is kind of shaped a little bit, more or less, if you use your imagination, like Noah's Ark. And the idea is, you take some change, you place it in here, and when it's filled up, we pass it along to someone who's less fortunate. It isn't just the money collected, it's the thought and the feeling that it represents.
So I went to a public school. I studied math and physics, and we studied how to solve math problems. I didn't know how to solve my own problems.
Rabbi David Aaron, a Jerusalem-based educator, reflects on his personal experience.
The real problems of life is what education should be focusing on. It's essentially about building people, and only great people will do great things.
It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Mr. President.
On March 30th, 1981, then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, delivered a luncheon address at the Washington Hilton.
Thank you very much.
He left the hotel at 2:27 p.m., but as he headed to his limousine, a would-be assassin opened fire. Reagan was critically wounded, and the nation collectively gasped in horror. The president survived, and at a public gathering 2 weeks later, the Lubavitcher Rebbe insisted that the instructive lesson of the assassination attempt must similarly survive. The Rebbe saw the event as a wake-up call for the nation to upgrade its approach to education.
שדור der חוק המדינה מדав gehen in a Beis Sefer. In der Beis Sefer miusod und durchgenommen. A was darf geben a Beis Sefer darf geben Jidis. Nicht darf ausformen, auftun, aufmachen. A dem Jeser Leib Hodom, als soll sein mit Midis Tevis. Und soll wissen, als stark, als geht und lernt in dem Beis Sefer. Aber der Riker lernen seiner ist, was zum Ton Teva sich. Und das ist der Teva Amiti für sich. Und das ist im Ganzen nicht rein in der Tochnis und in der Programm von Beis Sefer.
As much as we want to graduate mathematicians and scientists, we also want to graduate decent human beings.
Dr. Rona Novick, Dean of the Israeli Graduate School of Jewish Education and Administration, has given ample thought to this problem.
Very few educators would invite a charismatic speaker or have a big assembly program to create readers. They would understand that the way that we build reading skills is piece by piece and building block by building block. We start in kindergarten and first grade and we keep building on it. Well, we need to look at character education and social emotional learning in exactly the same way.
Judaism teaches us that it's important to give charity every day. And the more you give charity, that muscle of kindness within you gets stronger and stronger.
Rabbi Levi Greenberg and his wife Shana are emissaries of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in El Paso, Texas.
We embarked on a campaign to bring this message of daily giving to every single child in El Paso. And so we brought to El Paso the ARC campaign. All the children in the school received one of these boxes, and they were told that the purpose of this box is to be taken home and filled every day. If they have extra coins, they should ask their parents for some money. After a month of collecting money, their class would nominate charities that should receive their combined money. And the winning charity would receive the combined monies that they had collected throughout that month. The ARC project, giving money every day, takes acts of random kindness and turns them into acts of routine kindness.
Raising a generation of individuals empowered with a sense of purpose and trained to pursue acts of kindness is an important factor in curing and preventing numerous social ills, including the reduction of hate and bigotry, along with anti-Semitism.
The more we give, the more we respect. We respect human life, we respect property, the more dignity we have for ourselves and for society. If we want to stop anti-Semitism, we have to stop hatred. And we have the opportunity to nip hatred in the bud by increasing in acts of goodness and kindness and inspiring and encouraging all of humanity to do so. Every single person should give charity every day, and hatred will be a thing of the past.
The call of the hour, more necessary than ever, is for each of us to adopt a charity box for regular, daily contributions, and to encourage all around us, family and friend, Jew and non-Jew, to act similarly. Actively demonstrate, encourage, and promote kindness, sympathy, and altruistic care. If a little illumination eliminates a lot of darkness, think of what a rapidly swelling force of systematic goodness can achieve for our communities, and ultimately for humanity. It's time to turn up the light.
Four weeks ago, as many of you know, because I came here directly to this Zoom from there, at the International Conference of Shluchim of Chabad Rabbis in New York, Rabbi Levi Greenberg, who by the way is a close friend of El Paso, Texas, presented about the ARC program at the conference in New York. I remember going over to him afterwards and asking him some details. And I'd like to announce here publicly that I would like to try to bring the ARC program into PUSD, into the Pasadena Unified School District, possibly other areas in Sagiba Valley, to try to bring this program. I think it has an immense power when children are brought up in their own homes, giving money to a charity that they're going to choose or they're going to vote for, to a good place to give to other people. To become a consistent giver is an amazing, amazing thing. So I'm making a petition to anybody on this group and to anybody watching the recording, and I'm going to do so again tonight in person. If anybody has contacts within the Pasadena Unified School District, I know some of you do, or if you have anyone in particular that you can think of that might be able to assist with this program, please let me know, and we're going to make it happen here in Pasadena. Anyways, I'd like to conclude this course. We've spent now 4 weeks, and hopefully we've taken a lot away from it. If you can join me on page 139. In lesson 1, we learned 3 very, very important factors about, I guess the way I would put this whole course is, how do we cope with the current reality of anti-Semitism until the time of Mashiach comes when anti-Semitism will be eradicated forever? In lesson 1, we learned 3 lessons. Until Mashiach comes, we will remain calm. We won't allow anti-Semitism to get to us because, number 2, we will trust in God and upgrade our connection with Him. And at the same time, that doesn't take away from the natural means that we are going to create, which can provide for our security, whatever that means, right? Putting up security cameras or walls around the shul and the gates, etc. That was lesson 1. In lesson 2, we learned another 3 lessons. We shouldn't internalize anti-Semitism by trying to by trying to alter or assimilate ourselves from our Jewish heritage. And to the contrary, we should be open about our Jewish identity, benefiting Jews and fostering diversity. So in other words, benefiting Jews, and fostering diversity in general in our environments, in our situation, it's in the United States, for other minorities. And the third lesson that we learned in lesson 2 was that we should share an awareness of God's mission for all humanity, thereby help individuals who are experiencing a ditch complex avoid experiencing that inner void. In lesson 3, last week, we learned about the divine gift and how thankful we should be for the gift of the Holy Land. And we should seek to strengthen its security and prosperity. And today, we learned about avoiding labels and public shaming, even of people that are staunchly against us. Instead, we try to produce results, even from those that hate us, because you never know when you can appeal to a different circuit in their brain to try and achieve a different result. And to that, I'd like to add one more thing. And with this, we'll conclude the entire course. What about how we relate to each other within the Jewish community? Maybe we should be taking a look at that too. I know a lot of you right about now are thinking, hold on a second, I came to a course about anti-Semitism, not about anti-Jews against Jews. But as it turns out, the two are very, very much related. Let's turn for one final time to the story of Purim. In text 12a, Haman is petitioning Achashverosh that he wants to destroy the Jews. Joanne, what are the words that he uses?
You want me to read this?
Yes, please. Text 12a, if you can.
Haman told King Ahasuerus, there is one nation that is scattered and dispersed among your nations throughout all the countries of your empire.
Hold on a second. Scattered and dispersed? That doesn't seem to be a negative quality. That seems to be a good quality, no? What do you care so much about a minority if there's a couple dozen of them in every town, if they're scattered and dispersed? Haman is mentioning a quality that he sees among the Jewish people. He sees in them a lack of unity, and that has left them vulnerable. The Megillah Setarim is a commentary on the Megillah, and he in text 12b, he elaborates. Joanne, can you finish off for us?
Haman claimed there's one nation that is scattered and dispersed. He was referring to the fact that Jews were internally divided. He argued that they would be unable to defend themselves because a discordant people cannot develop a cohesive strategy, nor would they pay heed to their leaders. Subsequently, when the Jews repented, there was unity among them, and they gathered in their cities with mutual love. We therefore send packages of food to one another on Purim to demonstrate that this mutual love is a cause of our deliverance.
Haman saw within the Jewish people discord, labels, shaming one person or another person because they were like this or because they were like that. They're from this city, they're from that city, they're from this origin or that origin, without getting into even the more exterior features. And therefore, he said they are vulnerable. Now, this is true on a very, very simple level, on a political level. They won't be able to band together to defend themselves. But it's also true on a spiritual level. Haman said he saw within the Jewish people a lack of Barchenu Avinu Kulanu Ke'echad. In our prayers, we ask God to bless us, our Father, all of us as one. What are we asking for? Our sages explain that Hashem is more inclined to bless us when he sees that we are all one. And Haman saw that at this time in history, the Jewish people are lacking this. And therefore, they're vulnerable, not just on a physical level, but on a spiritual level as well. And that's why when the Jewish people realized that that's why this decree is coming upon them, led by Mordechai, the first thing they went for was mutual love. And till today, that is what we celebrate every single year on Purim, that our deliverance came because we were able to be together, because we were able to achieve divine protection by bringing our people together, by acting as one, by being unified. Barchenu Avinu Kulanu Ke'echad. Bless us, our Father, all of us as one, because on a spiritual level, unity leads to more protection. So if there's one more lesson that I will add to the list that we just went through on page 139 that we take away from this course, I would add that it's not just anti-Semites that we have to learn how they operate and how to get along with them, etc. We should spend time, real time, meditating on what we can do to get along with those that we disagree with. Find someone in shul or someone in your friend group or your not friend group that you know that there's something in the way and try to figure out how you could get along with them. Spend some time on it. Nothing in life changes in one moment. Everything changes by thinking about something properly, meditating upon that, and then eventually that leads into action. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. For now, please turn your attention to the video screens for a brief overview of this lesson.
Lesson 4, Change of Heart. 1. The Torah's narrative of Jacob and Esau suggests that by employing the right words and deeds, we can influence those we deem to be against us. Accordingly, the 2nd century sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai traveled to Rome to win concessions for the benefit of the Jewish community, establishing a model followed by countless others, most famously the European court Jews of the early modern period. 2. Jews did not feel inferior while conducting diplomatic missions. They knew that the Jewish future depended on God, and that their job was to generate a garment behind which God could conceal his blessings. A firm belief that they were in God's hands inspired in them a sense of pride. 3. According to modern neuroscience, brains are built of multiple parts that weigh in concerning different choices, each part competing to control the single output channel of behavior. This explains why an individual with Jewish friends can nevertheless carry out a drunken tirade against Jews. Conversely, it explains why Jews can gain assistance from unlikely sources. 4. Today, we are finally able to campaign publicly against those who oppose us. However, it is often counterproductive to publicly brand individuals as enemies or anti-Semites. Slow to shame and quick to engage is still an effective route. 5. We must do everything possible to condition society to bring out the best in people rather than their more sinister elements. In the sphere of education, this means promoting an approach that is not restricted to acquiring information, but rather includes proper character traits, self-discipline, and the awareness that all humans are created to actively generate goodness in their environments. 6. Living in harmony with our fellow Jews enables us to better collaborate to ward off threats and promote our interests. Jewish mysticism teaches that God responds positively to Jewish unity, providing overt blessings of protection and goodness.
Thank you all for joining us for this 4-week course. I hope that you found that it delivered on what we promised, to try and outsmart anti-Semitism, at least to a certain degree. And at the very least, what we've done is we've spent some time thinking about something that we often don't spend time thinking and learning about. Instead, we tend to just react emotionally and react instinctively, etc. And I hope you won't mind my saying so, but this ties directly into what the next course is about. We're taking a little break now. We're not doing a course till after the holidays, until after Shabbat of Torah here, which we do in mid-January here in the 25-hour Shabbat of Torah, when we put out the big tent outside, etc. The next course is titled Meditation from Sinai. And contrary to what well, I guess what first blush of the name might imply, it's not about trying to figure out how to do modern meditation, or the meditation that comes from the East in a Jewish way. In fact, it does the exact opposite. It tries to encourage us to do what we're calling meditation from Sinai, as opposed to just meditation. I have a little video trailer that I'm going to show for you in just a moment, but I would encourage all of you to attend. It's going to be a 6-week course. It's starting on February 7th. So it'll run from February 7th through March 14th, 6 Mondays. We're going to be following the same format as we did for this course, 1:00 p.m. online, 7:30 p.m. in person, including dinner. The price per person will be $99 or $189 per couple. However, as we did last time, for attendees of this course, there will be an early bird special. We're going to cut it off right by the end of Hanukkah. I'm going to try to get everybody from this course who's interested in it to be registered. If you register by then it will be $89 per person or $169 per couple. That being said, there's an easy way to register just by texting me. The emails and the forms and all that, I'm not so great at that. So if you text me or email me and just tell me I'm in for the next course, please charge my card. I'll be happy to take care of that, and you'll be all set. You won't hear from me again until February 7th, at least with regards to this course. Why do I encourage this course? First of all, the course is not just going to talk about meditation from Sinai. It's actually going to execute it in each lesson, besides for the 6th one, which we can talk about, which we'll kind of talk about how meditation works into the practical world and how Judaism, how can we talk about Judaism being a meditative religion when Judaism is all about action, right? Ritual actions and moral actions and chesed actions, etc. But the first 5 lessons are going to focus primarily on meditation. There's going to be 2 meditative experiences that we'll do in the middle of each lesson. And it's really going to be that last point we spoke about. Too often in life, we're just moving through life. And Chassidus encourages us, Torah and Chassidus, encourage us to not do that, but rather to take some time to think, to learn about a particular element, whatever it is. And we're going to choose a few of them, but we're going to more importantly try to learn to do that with everything in life. And when we learn about something, then we can meditate for a while about what we learned, and then that can begin to affect our emotions and our emotional state of being and our mental state of being, etc. Please turn your attention to the video screen for a brief trailer. I think it's inside the slide here. I have it. Here we go. Thank you for allowing me to present that. If you're ready to join us for this course, please just shoot me a text or an email. I'll be happy to make sure you're all set, and I'll see you in February with regards to that. Other than that, I want to end off as I always do. It's a tremendously humbling experience, and it only gets more and more humbling as we move along, and there's more and more students, that so many people trust me with their time. As my life becomes busier, and I can't speak for each of you, but I'm sure everybody has, children, family, events, work, life, balance, the whole thing, right? And the fact that you would give me, in this instance, 4 lessons, each one 90 minutes of your time, is not something I take lightly. And I thank you for that opportunity. And I hope that I was able to reflect in kind, and that it came across in my teaching that I valued that time. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Zushi,
Rabbi.
so much.
You're welcome. All right. Have a
See you
good
next
one.
Thank
You
you
too.
so
Have a
much.
good one.
Till next time.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.